assassination of Abraham Lincoln. First of all, it did not start as an assassination attempt. It was originally going to be a kidnapping. So keep that in mind. But then the South, surrendered, and then Booth was like, hey, maybe we should kill the guy instead. So they tried to kill the guy instead. And then they did kill the guy instead, but there was more than just him on the plate. So here we go. First, let's talk about Booth. John Wilkes Booth was an actor. John Wilkes Booth also had a bigger brother who was an actor too. And you guys might be able to relate a little bit. His bigger brother, well, he was the favorite of the family, according to John Wilkes Booth. He was the one that Dad enjoyed most. Dad liked having him in all of his pictures. Dad enjoyed his career. And even as an actor, people said Edwin Booth, John Wilkes Booth's older brother, was a better actor. So he was always living under the shadow of his brother. Well, Booth started acting and he loved plays dealing with Julius Caesar's death. He loved the idea of a hero taking down a tyrant. Maybe you should have paid attention to history, because Brutus, the guy that kills Julius Caesar, he doesn't end up very well in his life. Either will Booth. Well, anyway, they're sitting around. Booth, this is like before the Civil War is done. He's contemplating what he should do to end the tyranny of Abraham Lincoln. Let's kidnap him. So he gets with a bunch of his buddies, a guy named George Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and they're all hanging out in Mary Surratt's house. Boarding house, but house. And they're discussing what they should do. And they first plan to kidnap him. And then the South loses. And they go, yeah, we should kill him. Because if we kill him, we'll be the heroes of the story. Just like Brutus was not the hero of the story, but apparently he didn't read too much into history. Here is what happens. This is the plan. We're going to cut off the head of the snake, and then we're going to cut off the head of the lion, and we're going to cut the head off the bear. They're going to kill the president, they're going to kill the vice president, and they're going to kill the Secretary of State all in one night. So here's the plan. Booth, he's going to go to Ford's Theater, he's going to kill the president. He's going to send George Surratt to kill the vice president. He's going to send Powell to kill the Secretary of State. If you do that in one night, the whole government's going to be like, what? And it's going to be bad for everybody. So, Booth goes into Ford's Theater. Now, he's an actor, so people notice him. People know that he's been there a lot, so it's not a big deal. Goes up to the presidential booth, gets inside, and he locks the door behind him and puts a bar there to make sure no one can come in. There's a second door that actually leads into the presidential booth. Gets up, opens the door, walks behind Lincoln, and with a small gun, it's like I'll show you in class what it looks like, a small gun, puts it basically to Lincoln's head, bang, shoots the president. The president doesn't die there. He doesn't die till like 9 hours later. He jumps off, actually he stabs another person that's in the booth, and then he jumps off the balcony onto the stage. His boot gets caught on like the decorative bunting that's on the outside of the booth, and he lands weird on his leg, breaking his leg. He then stands up there with a knife on stage going, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. And thinking that this is going to be somehow like an amazing thing that everyone's going, oh yeah, that's why he did that. No one knows what's going on. They think he's part of the play, like some random part of the play of a My American Cousin. But he wasn't. And then he humbles off, gets on a horse, and takes off. At the same time, Powell goes to Secretary of State's place, and Secretary of State just like had a horse accident, and his neck is in a brace, and he's like in bed resting because of what happened to his neck. Well, he goes in there and he says, hey, I got medicine for the secretary. Powell does. And he gets all the way up to the top stairs, okay? And the son of Secretary Stewart's like, hey, here's the deal. What are you doing? He's sleeping, and you need to get away. So Powell's like, oh, okay. Turns around, and when he comes back this way towards his son, he has a gun in his hand, puts it right up to his face. Click, click, click. The gun misfires. So Stewart takes the gun and starts beating his son with it. He then gets into the bedroom of Secretary Stewart and with a knife starts stabbing at him. But Secretary Stewart has a neck brace. So every time he's stabbing at the neck brace is actually blocking the knife. He thinks he killed him. Now, he did open his face a little bit, his jaw is a little bit damaged, but generally speaking, he's okay. He then leaves the bedroom cuts his way downstairs, leaves the place, but he gets lost and he ends up into a cemetery, and he sleeps in the cemetery that night because he doesn't know the town very well. Now, George Atzerodt was supposed to kill the vice president, but he just gets drunk. He goes to a hotel, gets drunk, never goes through with anything, and just sits there and gets drunk. That's what happens to him. Eventually, David Harold meets up with Booth. He has he's like the getaway driver, okay? He has a fresh horse, he has the means to get a gun, and they eventually go get a gun. And Booth and Harold are gone for 12 days. It takes 12 days to find Booth and Harold. They're on the run. They end up going to a swamp. They eventually do some other shenanigans, but that's what happens to them. Powell, who slept in the cemetery, he stumbles out and finds his way to Mary Surratt's house, who's being questioned by the police at the time. And Mary Surratt is saying, I don't know where Booth is. I don't know. I mean, yeah, they've been here, but And right when she's talking to the police, here comes Powell, the guy who tried to kill Secretary of State, stumbles into the boarding house while the police are there. And he's like, oh. They arrest him, they arrest her, and eventually we'll get to the end of that. Booth ends up going through the woods, through the swamps. He ends up on the Potomac River at night, and they end up being afraid they're going to get caught, so they stop paddling, so they end up back on the same side of the Potomac River in the morning, so they're having a bad time. Eventually, they meet these other Confederates, ex-Confederates going back home from the war, and they're discussing things. Eventually, they find out, hey, you're John Wilkes Booth, you killed the president. John Wilkes Booth's like, it's nothing to be proud of, And one of the guys goes, can I have your autograph? The last thing you want right now is John Wilkes Booth autograph. There are actors that are being hung up in trees or getting shot at, or people that just look like Booth are being attacked. This is not a good time to be associated with acting or John Wilkes Booth, period, but I want your autograph. So this young Confederate eventually is running off his mouth about how he saw John Wilkes Booth. The police find him, bring him to a tree, throw a rope over the tree and say, you're going to tell us where he is or you're going to hang right here. He's like, oh, he's at the Garrett farm. He's at the Garrett farm. So he gives up John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth is there. He still has his broken leg. He's been out in the wilderness for 12 days, basically. He's sitting in a barn. The barn gets surrounded. Harold is still with him. And Harold's like, I'm done, man. I've been on the run with you for 12 days. I'm done. I want to give up. So he leaves. And John Wilkes Booth goes, he had nothing to do with it. Yeah, he had nothing to do with it. The dude's been with you for 12 days. He had everything to do with it. Anyway, Booth is still in the barn. And he has a rifle. And he's aiming it towards the door, basically for anyone that's going to come into the barn, he's going to shoot him. Well, a soldier on the outside, puts a gun through a hole in the barn, shoots right through the neck, right here, actually paralyzes Booth. Booth is dragged out eventually. He's asked somebody to lift his hands, and because he's such a drama queen, he goes, useless, like an actor, and then he dies. So he's dead. But then the trial takes place, and there's a whole bunch of things that we're going to talk about in class, but here's the basis of the trial. Is you have all these conspirators, people that were in on the whole thing. They may not have committed a crime, but they at least knew about it. They didn't say anything. You have Atzerodt, who was supposed to kill the vice president, never actually did, because he got drunk. You have Powell, who tried to kill Secretary Stewart, but didn't because, neck brace. You have Mary Surratt, who it was her house or boarding home that they made the plans in, but she didn't actually do any of the plans. You have Harold, who's like the getaway driver. And you have Dr. Mudd, which we'll talk more about him in class. The trial is going to determine the fate of these people. But unfortunately for most of them, they die. They get hanged, and they have a couple people that serve life in prison and eventually get pardoned. But we'll talk about those in class. Let's get to the debate. So there's going to be a trial next week. When you're in class, you're either on the prosecution side or you're on the defense side. And if you're the prosecution, you are trying to convict or get the jury to convict guilty and punishable by hanging to one of the people that I gave you. Either Mary Surratt or George Atzerodt. If you're the defense, you're defending these guys. And now your goal is to come up with arguments that prove that the person is guilty or not guilty, depending if you're the prosecution or the defense. Understand, trials aren't just about the facts. There is circumstantial evidence, and there's also the credibility of the person on the stand. So when you're researching George Atzerodt or Mary Surratt, understand you should look at their personal qualities because that might sway the jury. Because if you can prove that this person was a horrible person even before this, you might sway the jury to go, if they're that much of a horrible person, maybe they would be willing to do something like this. Or if you're the defense, if you can prove that this person was an awesome person, they donated to charities, they went to church every Sunday, whatever, to make it look like they're like a good person, you might sway the jury into thinking they could never do something like this. So your goal is to come up with, using primary sources that I gave you as well as research on your own, is whether or not the person in question deserves to be hanged, or is guilty and deserves to be hanged, or they're not guilty and they should be let go. Your goal is to sway the other side, and I will be the judge depending on how well you do this. This is going to be for next week, but you need to start looking at the primary sources this week. Good luck. We'll see you in court.